Welcome to the Method Podcast. I'm Aidan Simpson, and this is where we talk to designers at Google about work, life, and the future of design.
Something I was really excited about, like from a method standpoint in that sprint, was actually doing like a Lego exercise with the team. So we recently were actually trained to do something called Lego Serious Play. And basically what it is using team building with Legos to solve business challenges.
Today I'm talking with Sydney Hessel, a user experience researcher on the corporate engineering team. Sydney and I talked about the ins and outs of the sprint methodology, serious play, Legos, and how to help people get out of their comfort zones to come up with creative ideas. So enough from me, let's get into it.
So I've been at Google almost 5 years, actually, which is crazy because the time just flies by. So I've actually been on 3 different UX teams while at Google. Currently, I'm on Corpinge UX, specifically, as I think you know, on our sprint team. So the first team at Google working full-time on design sprints, which has been awesome.
Just to set some context and to give listeners out there an idea, how did you come to Google? What was your kind of path?
Yeah. I'm making a face because there's a lot of different things that I feel like I've worked on. I've always been kind of a broad person. I have like a liberal arts background, so I've studied art history, design, social science. So before Google, I had actually been working as a researcher at a firm that worked on studying art experiences, which is incredibly niche. And what it meant was basically we partnered with arts organizations around the US to study how their literal audiences, for example, a theater audience or a museum audience, experienced the offerings of different orgs. And so we'd research that and kind of the value of the arts so that the organization would have some ammo to get funding in an area that sometimes people think is not able to be measured. So that was a long story short, that was what I was doing before Google. And I was very interested in UX as a result of being interested in art and being interested in design and research all together.
Let's just set some context for people and talk about what is a sprint.
Design sprints are a methodology. They're a 5-phase methodology that takes teams through development and often involves designing, sketching, and testing ideas with users. So the idea is that teams often have sort of hypotheses about what products they might build and what building those products will do for people. But sometimes historically it's taken a lot of time to actually get to the point where you'd show something to users, and that can be kind of this like development fallacy. Like we want to get stuff out there sooner, even if they're early stage concepts, so we can learn and go from there. So that's kind of the real punch to this method is like, hey, let's get together, let's do work quickly as a team and then bring users in, as soon as day 4 or day 5. And yeah, I guess for context, these things are between, I'd say, 2 is probably the shortest sprint I've ever run comfortably with all 5 phases. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to people listening. Then I'd say I'm up to, 5 days of sprinting, which can be quite intense as well. So that's the full context for sprints. And then what our team does is basically we take that methodology and partner with different teams to apply it. So our sprints can be everything from like visioning sprints to design sprints, knowledge sprints, or even just other sort of mini explorations, workshops, other types of applications of what I guess I consider to be like a broader design thinking framework.
Where did the sprint methodology come from?
I think that Jake Knapp is very well known at Google Ventures for having sort of pioneered that work within the context of startups and kind of growing it within that context. And then Kai, Marta, Nadia Dierkova, who's now at Airbnb, had kind of worked together to, at least my understanding is, refine it specifically for Google. But again, for me, like this is just like, your giant toolbox that when a team comes to you, you're just going to be picking and choosing from no matter what. And we tend to do a lot of customization with sprints and trying out new methods too. So, but that's kind of the origin story I know. But yeah, again, I think you'd have to talk to different folks. And my sense is that like with any kind of methodology, like it's not just one person and not just one place. It tends to be like a context, many different people at one point thinking about something. And I think that this was kind of ripe to be born at Google. We're already a super collaborative culture, and it was only a matter of time before this would probably come to us.
What is hard about your current project?
So I guess I should say, so we've been around for maybe about 1.5 years as a team. It's myself and then my colleague Vivia Liu, our UX designer. So we're kind of a UXR, UXD pair working specifically on design sprints within Corpinge. And that's a huge product space. I didn't know this actually when I didn't work on Corpinge. You kind of think, okay, there are a couple internal apps. No, there are actually hundreds and hundreds of different internal apps. And so a ton of need across the company. And I think it's been very cool to set up a team that works on that because we work with partners that have never worked with UX before primarily. So it's been very cool to kind of introduce them to design thinking, to sprinting, to what it means to build a product collaboratively. So it's been super cool.
How did that conversation come about to start up a team dedicated to design sprints?
Yeah, totally. It actually predates me. So there is a core team at Google that's been working on something called Sprint Master Academy, which is our big training program for sprints at Google, and also just working on the methodology in general, kind of developing it and tailoring it to be something that Google as a company can kind of take and run with. So maybe about 2 years ago, Marta Ray Barbaro, who's a UX researcher here, and Kai Haley, one of the UX designers and leads of sprinting and design advocacy, kind of got together and they started thinking about this idea of having a team that just worked on sprints, which is totally new, really. I mean, and there are a couple other methods teams at Google, but just the idea of being focused on sprints was new. And so we were super lucky to have like a VP, a team, and other folks that were supportive of it. So I kind of came on board as the first hire to get that started and sort of establish like, hey, what does this team actually look like? What should it do? And all that kind of stuff, which was awesome. Really cool.
Why should a team run a design sprint?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing that teams that come to us that we don't think should run a design sprint say is that, hey, we have this amazing thing, like we want to actually go out and build it, we want to do this. And really, like, design sprints are best used for when you don't know the answer. And that sounds very obvious, but like a lot of teams will come to us just like excited about the idea of like having a team summit or like hanging out, which is totally a valid aim. But for us, like, we often have to redirect those teams because, yeah, you just have to have something to like bite your teeth into. And I'd say also as a UX researcher, I'm very interested in having our sprints fueled by some sort of data. So a lot of teams will actually do sprints or design exercises without user data, but we try to always do some level of upfront collection or data gathering. So a lot of times I'm responsible for like going out into like a totally new field very quickly and trying to gather some information that we can then take into the sprint and use in some way and actually use to structure sprints sometimes too. Like we'll have sprints that will focus on different aspects of a system that are problematic or maybe different persona groups that would use the tool, right? And kind of dividing up our sprint structure to match whatever it is we're trying to do based on what we know. So that's been super fun to play with, just like how can you get a big group of people? And I feel all the time really lucky because sometimes when you're kind of an IC, you're just doing work on your own. But when you're a sprint master, which is what we call a facilitator for sprints, you can kind of go in and actually spread work across people and amplify your own work. And of course, people have a lot of agency too in what they do during sprints. So I think that's been really interesting to watch too.
You mentioned the 5 kind of parts of the design sprint. It seems like it's very flexible as well, that you can apply it to not only design problems, but feature problems and also process problems. What are some sprints that have really pushed your kind of understanding or boundaries of the framework that you've set up?
A couple weeks ago, I ran a sprint that was a type of sprint we've run before, which is a process sprint. But we were actually looking to make a policy for our team. And I guess for a little bit of context, the team that we were working with, it's not a product team. It's a team that works on supporting events across Google, which might sound deceptively simple, like as if, don't you just, put on the event, but
put it on
actually,
the calendar.
Right, that's how we run a large event, just put it down. But it's actually a lot of different teams, like across Google, like globally working to make sure that everything's kind of in place for that to happen, right? That might mean like the technical setup, scheduling, like making sure that everything's functioning, making sure Googlers understand like what level of support is appropriate, all these different pieces. And so we brought folks together to sprint on that. And specifically what the team wanted to do was build kind of like an event support policy that then could be shared out with Googlers and with the internal team as well. So that sprint was tricky because it had a lot of layers and there were not only process pieces to it, but also this idea of a policy, which is a written text of rules. And then aside from that, also kind of the design level being, where that policy would live. So for me, like I was kind of looking at this like 3-layered cake, like thinking, how can we sprint on these 3 different layers and doing a lot of play with that. And yeah, I mean, what we ended up doing is some of the traditional exercises, but also bringing in like other types of modules to try to get at, for example, policy design principles in a way that we wouldn't have necessarily done with other types of sprint focuses. Something I was really, really excited about, like from a method standpoint in that sprint, was actually doing like a Lego exercise with the team. So we recently were actually trained to do something called Lego Serious Play. And basically what it is using team building with Legos to solve business challenges. So we adapted that framework to actually have the team get together around a table and start to build their different perspectives on what an ideal policy would look like. So each person actually built a model with the little Lego guys and the ladders for like, what this policy should look like. And people built a lot of different things. One woman built a quadrant of like, here are the different areas we need to focus on. And there was King Larry because there was this little Lego that had a crown on it. So there was a King Larry and all these different characters that kind of started to develop. And then what we did once everyone built their own like individual perspective on it was have everyone actually try to build a shared vision for what an ideal policy would look like. And it was amazing because the team kind of all leaned into the table and, they're hovering over it and spending a lot of time negotiating. It gets very serious. That's why they call it serious play, sort of what goes where. And it was quite amazing to watch because from that, we were able to ask people to, tell us a story about that thing you've built and extract principles from that story, which actually ended up being super clarifying for that team in terms of like, what exactly do we need to do? And yeah, it was interesting to watch, and it was something new as a facilitator. I was trying, wasn't sure how it was going to go, but it was super successful in that context. I'm hoping we can, try new stuff more often as well. So using Legos to tackle policy is not in the job description, but kind of just came out.
You mentioned there kind of the collaborative aspect of a sprint as well. How important and why is that so important in a design sprint?
Yeah, it's super interesting. And actually, as a UX researcher, it's something that we've also been trying to collect data around. So trying to understand, how is it that actually getting together for, these 2 to 5 days, whatever it is, how does that actually help people? I think that for me, it's a lot of anecdotes at this point. We have a little bit of initial data on it, but yeah, a lot of anecdotes. Just watching people come together and initially like not knowing each other. And as I mentioned before, like by the end of the sprint, there's just this kind of sense of camaraderie that we see with a ton of teams. And that when we often follow up with them, sometimes it's entirely new like partnerships between teams that didn't know each other existed.
There's something nice about locking people in a room for a period of time like that. And they have no distractions, but they kind of really work on the relationships and they come out with a shared vision that everyone can work towards.
What do you think about the sprints you've been a part of? Is there anything that you feel like surprised you about it, or anything that you were like, whoa, didn't expect that, or whoa, that didn't work? Or I'm always curious to hear like sprint stories.
I was very surprised by the lightning talks. I was more surprised than I thought I would be.
Oh, okay, by the information.
By the information, and I think for our particular problem, how much we could have leveraged those teams beforehand. I wish we'd known that a lot sooner.
I do hear that a lot too, because I think a lot of people look at a sprint agenda, and for people that don't know, basically the first day, though I've seen it as short as a half day and as long as a day and a half, will be typically committed to what's called an understand phase, where basically you just do a really intense kind of deep dive on all the information that's known about your particular challenge. You bring in other teams to give their 2 cents on it. They might not be working on the same thing, but kind of an analogous problem. Teams tend to come out of that tired, but very, very excited and interested and, connected with people again that they never would have been connected with. So I think it's an awesome way to kick it off.
I guess the other thing I really liked about it was it drove user-centered design from the beginning of a problem. How important is it to get this design thinking and this process in front of maybe people who aren't in UX teams?
Yeah, I think that's been actually, as I mentioned before, something really interesting about our team, because our primary partners are really people that have not done design sprints. They are not UX researchers or UX designers. They're not in UX. So I think it's an amazing way to introduce teams to that discipline, because in some ways it's kind of like a little appetizer, like sampler plate of UX stuff. And of course, for any UXer, we know there's much more work that has to happen beyond sprints, which is something I have to say again and again to teams we work with. But, just being able to try for the first time, if you've never, we have people in our sprints who have never like sketched before. They've just never done it, right? Like it was not a part of their training. They've never just sat down and drawn something, or they don't feel like, in their day-to-day jobs, maybe that they have as much sort of creative liberty. Maybe they come from a discipline that has certain rules and is very established. And the idea of doing like creative problem solving is actually kind of new, at least in the design context. So I guess watching people do some of these things for the first time and just their reactions to it, like it just tends to be just like the joy of having fun at work, the joy of working through a problem in a way that is exciting, creative. And yeah, that's been fascinating to watch, I think. So it can really change that kind of fabric for how a team is functioning in a way that can be really positive and collaborative.
How do you get people who aren't from a creative background to dive into the sketching and not feel self-conscious.
Totally. I think we run a lot of exercises that if you're a UX or listening to this, you're familiar with, like, squiggly bird or other things like that. I think I like to keep the tone of sprints lighthearted, at least for the beginning pieces, kind of positive, because I think that definitely helps people if they're feeling comfortable with each other, like to do things that they've never done before, which, yeah, can be scary. And, every sprint will have a bunch of people that are like, I can't draw, or like, I can't do this, or I'm not sure I want to do this, or even with the Legos that I did, there was a woman at the beginning of the day who told me, Sydney, like I just can't do Legos. I don't like Legos. Like,
this doesn't feel professional.
This doesn't work like for me. And by the end of the day, what you see is as long as you can get them started with something small and low risk, there's a lot of ground that can very quickly be covered. And it's always those people that are, the best builders and the best artists, the people that kind of denounce themselves in the beginning or resisted. And I found that, I think everyone can do those things, but those people especially tend to grow a lot, even over the course of like a day. So it's really cool to watch.
How important do you think it is to bring an element of play into your day-to-day job like that?
Yeah, I mean, you probably tell from how I'm speaking about it. I think pretty important. It's something that's actually been really wonderful, like working on a sprint team, because we get to do sprints all the time. And teams that we work with often will kind of come out of their day-to-day not knowing what to expect, especially if they haven't sprinted. And I think that people have to have their minds open to other people's ideas, to solutions, and that if you can bring in like humor or play or a lightheartedness, I think it helps people open up to each other a lot. And I've seen the flip side where teams can be, kind of more weighted down and more serious, and it can be actually much harder to work through problems than if they took a moment to kind of do something silly or fun or bond as a team. And we do a ton of like icebreaker type exercises that are really, really silly. And initially, there's a lot of skepticism, right? People are kind of like, what is why are we, drawing like a crazy bird, or why are we, drawing this thing on a card? But I do think that actually kind of matters from like a business perspective and a development perspectives.
I'm just going to ask a few like quick fire questions. What is something that has led to growth in your current role?
Not being too afraid even to try stuff when it's high stakes. I think that in some ways, all of our jobs at Google are high stakes. We're building stuff for the world, stuff for Google. And you might be afraid to try a new method or something else, but just do it and then make sure to collect a ton of feedback on it. Just being very transparent.
Any examples from your current role where that might have happened?
I mean, the Lego thing was definitely experimental. And I think going out there, like at the end of the day, I definitely made sure to be like, hey guys, like, what'd you think about the Lego thing? How did this go? And just like continue to be cool with kind of making yourself vulnerable in that way, I think.
What are you not very good at?
I'm not very good at saying no. I tend to want to sprint with every team and also want to meet all stakeholders' demands, which sometimes does not work with sprints, especially because you have to be very firm and clear about, what exactly you're doing and what you're not doing. So I think for all the sprint masters learning out there, be better than me and be very clear about what you can't do or what isn't feasible, and don't try to do too much, especially for your first couple sprints.
What are you most excited about?
Oh my gosh. And I didn't even get into this, but I'm very excited about sprints in the world. We've run a couple sprints with different nonprofits where we've actually been tackling issues like sex trafficking or, pastoralists in Africa needing like raising land for herds for food sustainability. So something that we didn't talk about a lot, but something that I'm really excited about and other people are too, is definitely like how can sprints be tailored to like nonprofit context, to maybe even like government context, to societies. So when we think about it as like a product development methodology, but it's so much more than that. And I think that we're just kind of reaching a point where different people at Google are starting to explore that.
How are those opportunities coming about?
It's been really interesting. So Kai, again, and my manager, Bergen, have worked a little bit with .org to actually partner with them and actually build in sprints to some of those grants. And as a part of like kind of the grantees package, they might be able to run sprints with Google, which again is super amazing. So there's a ton of interest too. And I'd say just coming through other channels, like I ran a sprint for Google Serve, for example, with Planned Parenthood. And, we did kind of like a mini sprint where they thought about how could we redesign our appointment scheduling flow? What would that look like if this was totally different, and how can it be better? And at this point, Planned Parenthood is basically asking if we'll do like sprint master training for them, which will of course be more of a sprint workshop, but there's just a ton of demand.
How does that make you feel that this kind of methodology that you've worked so hard on is now getting out into the world?
I think it's really exciting. And I think it's also an opportunity for us to, I guess be a bit humble, because sprinting with nonprofit is that, there's a lot that we need to learn from how organizations like that work. different structures in terms of donors, whatever it is that it takes. So I think that you learn a lot when you throw a methodology that you feel you have perfected into a totally different context and learn actually, hey, like we need to adjust things, we need to change it. So it'll be interesting to see how much a different way of working can just be a part of that, beyond just kind of what we've seen as the canonical sprint. What would it look like if people just operated totally differently?
It'll be really interesting to see what feeds back into our internal processes as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, we learn a ton from doing those different types of engagement. So
awesome. Sydney, thanks so much for your time.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. This has been awesome. Cool.
Cheers.
Thanks.
All right, just a final word from us at Google Design. Sign up for the quarterly Google Design newsletter at design.google/subscribe. You can also find out more information about the things we talked about in the show notes at design.google/podcasts. And please subscribe to Method on Google Play, iTunes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, that's it from us.